Hello, friends. I hope you're well, and I hope you had a chance to look at the last video. And in that last video, we were talking about uh, aggregate supply. And we said we can look at aggregate supply in two different time horizons, in the long run and in the short run. And what we argued is that in the long run, aggregate supply is constant at full employment. Now, for now, we're just going to kind of assume that, and we'll come back to it later. What we want to focus on is in the short run. And in the short run, we kind of want to say three things about aggregate supply. One, that aggregate supply is illustrated by an upward sloping curve that shows you the amount of production at various price levels. So the aggregate supply curve shows you how much at a particular price level output firms will want to produce, right? That's one thing. The second thing is that curve slopes upward, right? The curve slopes upward. The third thing is that curve can shift, right? It can increase and it can decrease. Now, we established the upward sloping aggregate supply curve in the short run the last time we talked. Now, I would like to say something. If you were properly drawing it, if you wanted to properly draw it, and you should try to maybe properly draw it now, you wouldn't draw it as a straight upward sloping curve. It would be more bowed, right? It would be more bowed. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it would be more bowed. It would be flatter, rise, and then eventually become vertical, right? And there's a reason for that, that it would be drawn that way. But for now, we're just going to focus on it being upward sloping. And we said when we concluded the last video that the reason it was upward sloping is because in the short run, input prices are fixed and output prices are variable. That's what defines the short run. So in the short run, input prices are fixed and output prices are variable. So then if we wanted to answer another question, we would say, well, okay, well, why does the short run aggregate supply curve slope upward? Well, the answer to that question is because input prices are fixed in the short run and output prices are variable. Now, why does that lead to an upward sloping aggregate supply curve? Well, if you think about it, an upward sloping aggregate supply curve is a result of higher prices resulting in greater production. So why does higher prices result in greater production in the short run? Well, the reason is if input prices are fixed, all firms, or the preponderance of firms, per unit cost of production of the products or services that they produce is fixed, right? The price of the product compared to that per unit cost of production or average total cost is going to determine profit. So if you fix the per unit cost and the price goes up, profits increase. If profits increase, firms have an incentive to produce more. Hence, as price level goes up, prices go up, costs remain the same, profits expand, output expands, right? On the other hand, if the per unit cost of production remains the same and prices go down, profits go down, and firms produce less. Right? So this is the argument as to why the short run aggregate supply curve slopes up. It slopes up because higher prices lead to higher profits in the short run, right? And lower prices lead to lower profits in the short run. Why is that? Because the per unit cost of production is fixed in the short run. Now you could dicker about this. You could say, "Well, come on, it really isn't fixed." But remember this, that the real big per unit or the real big cost of production for firms is labor, right? 75% in many cases, on average, about 75% of the cost of producing anything is labor. And labor wages, nominal wages, are historically stagnant in the short run. Profitability increases and nominal wages lag behind that, right? So until firms start making more profits, then they eventually raise wages. We see that even now. I mean, wages have been relatively stagnant, as the economy has improved in general, right? So wages tend to be fixed in the short run. So sometimes instead of saying input prices are fixed in the short run, we say nominal wages are fixed in the short run, right? Because they're the biggest input price. So nominal wages are fixed, prices go up. As a result, profits go up, firms expand their output. Nominal wages are fixed, prices go down. As a result, firms contract their output. Hence, that short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. It's not an easy notion to comprehend, but just remember this. If the question is asked, why does the short run aggregate supply curve slope upward? Because input prices slash nominal wages are fixed in the short run. That's it. Now, what could cause the curve to shift? That's a big deal, right? What could cause all firms to want to produce more at every single price level? Or if we picked one price level, what could make firms want to produce more, right? So it wouldn't be higher prices because we're going to fix a price level, right? It'd have to be something else, right? Or some other factors, right? So if you think about it, what shifts the short run aggregate supply curve is things that shift the per unit cost of production of firms. Right now, this is an interesting notion. The short run is a snapshot, right? So in the short run, nominal wages are fixed and input prices are fixed. But what could happen is those input prices or nominal wages could change, right? When they do, the curve changes and you get a new short run, right? So shifting the curve really just repositions the short run. So the short run is here, then it shifts here, it may shift here, and it's just a different short run. Now that's the nature of the short run and the long run. I mean, this is an interesting notion, right? Here's something to remember in economics, and really in everything. The long run never gets here, right? In economics in particular, the long run, you're never in the long run. You're always in the short run, right? I mean, you live in the short run. It's like tomorrow. Tomorrow never gets here. Tomorrow never gets here because when it gets here, it's today, right? The long run is something that exists, but firms function in the short run. So really, the long run is shifting short runs. Think about that for a little bit, but for now, let's go back to how the short run aggregate supply curve might shift. What shifts the short run aggregate supply curve is a change in the pervasive change in the per unit cost of production. Something that is going to allow most firms in the economies, their per unit cost of production to either increase or decrease. Right? So for the short run aggregate supply curve to shift right, which would be an increase, right? Then something would have to come along, something would have to happen, or a series of things would have to happen to cause firms' per unit cost of production, right, to pervasively decline, right? The ACT of firms to decline. Not one firm or 10 firms, but pervasively, right? Or for the short run aggregate supply curve to shift leftward or decline, something would have to cause the per unit cost of production to increase, right? Now, if we were in class, I would ask you to think about things that might make this happen, and you may come up with some things. Who knows, right? I mean, you may just stare at me, or you might be looking at your phones, or whatever else you do, what other Spanish homework, or whatever else you do, English, or whatever math, or something else that you might be doing. But if I had your attention for a change, and I was asking you, I'd say, okay, what might make this happen, right? Now, if you were thinking about it, I'm sure you wouldn't, but if you were thinking about it, then you would say, well, wouldn't a change in nominal wages do it? Wouldn't, if nominal wages went down, wouldn't that change the per unit cost of production? And we know it can't change in the short run, but it can change and then reestablish a new short run, right? So nominal wages could in fact increase or decrease, And if nominal wages did in fact increase or decrease, it would shift the short run aggregate supply curve. Now, if you looked at your textbook, which you should since you're in cyber learning, right? If you look at your textbook, it's going to list three things that might shift the short run aggregate supply curve. Remember, an increase in short run aggregate supply, which is frankly what we want, right, means the per unit cost of production has gone down, and at every price level, firms want to produce more output. That's good, right? A decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve, that's not what we want, means that the per unit cost of production of firms has increased, right? So it's a decrease, the curve shifts left, and increase, the curve shifts right. Now, your textbook lists three things that might make that happen. One is a pervasive change in input prices. Two is a change in productivity. And three is a change in the legal governmental structure of the economy, right? So let's go through those three things just quickly. Now remember, what these three things have the potential to do is pervasively, and I keep using that word pervasively, meaning because it has to affect a large amount of the of firms, right? Not just a few firms that have lower costs, not just a few firms that have higher costs, but most firms. Now, cost structure has been impacted by something. Now, in terms of input prices, the inputs are, you know, rent, wages, interest, and profits, right? Excuse me, not the inputs that are there are labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurial talent, right? Those are the inputs that go into the production of products. Well, if there's a pervasive change in any of those, it might shift the short run aggregate supply curve. But the two that are most likely, the two inputs that are most likely, and has historically shifted the short run aggregate supply curve are one, wages, nominal wages. So if wages change, right, if they shift, right, if they increase or decrease, right, that's going to shift the short run supply curve based on those pervasive changes in wages, right? So if wages go up, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts left. If wages go down, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts right. Once the wages have stabilized, now the curve's in a different position. It's a new short run, right? This might make more sense when you get into advanced analysis at the end, right? And I don't even know if you'll get there, with the structure you're in, but it might make more sense then, right? But wages are one. The other is energy prices, right? I mean, in input, in your textbook, they talk about imported resources. I mean, it's a little, antiquated, but energy prices, if there's a change in energy prices, and we saw this in the 1970s, 73 and 74 and 79, we saw a dramatic increase in energy prices, which pervasively affected all firms, right? Everybody. So their per unit cost of production went up, and the short run aggregate supply curve in the economy shifted left and resulted in some really bad things. Now, who knows what the current circumstances is going to do? I mean, we don't know that yet. But the two big areas of input prices, that could affect, and you can read in your textbook, it will tell you more, but those are the two big, nominal wages and energy prices. The second factor that might change the per unit cost of production is a change in productivity. Now, up until this point, you haven't talked about productivity, but productivity is a really, really, really big deal. Productivity is the value of output you get per unit of input. So if you add a worker to the production process, that's a unit of input. An hour of a worker, right, is a unit of input. You add a worker to the production process, how much output do you get from that worker? So let's say an hour of work gives us 2 units of output. So the productivity of that worker per hour is 2 units, right? Now there's a lot of things that contribute to that productivity that you can read in your book. But if that productivity goes up, right, the per unit cost of production goes down. So if I add the same worker and the worker gives me 3 units of production instead of 2, and I pay that worker the same wage, then I get my per unit cost of production goes down. right? So if I pay the worker $10 an hour and he gives me 2 units, it costs me $5 a unit in labor. If I pay the worker $10 an hour and he gives me $3 3 units, then it costs me three something, 3.33 a unit to get the work, get the product. So it's almost like if productivity goes up, right? In essence, wages are going down, right? Wages are going down. So the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. Now, I mean, there's lots of things that can make productivity go up. And I mean, government does things to try to make productivity go up. In fact, the most recent Trump tax cut, the economist that tried to justify it, argued that that would be one of the things that would result from the tax cut. Firms would get all of this money, they would pour it into plant and capital. As a result, productivity would go up. As a result of productivity going up, workers would become more productive. Workers become more productive. There's more output. They can even make. Their wages might go up. I mean, there's lots of attempts to push productivity up. It's another story. For here, all we want to say is that productivity, a change in productivity can change the per unit cost of production. I mean, can productivity go down? Well, yeah. It's unlikely to decline as much as it is to increase. It might stay the same. I mean, basically, Gateway is the only place in the world that productivity goes down. That workers become less productive. But nevertheless, productivity changes in productivity is another thing that can impact short-run aggregate supply. The third is the governmental legal structure, meaning that if firms have to pay to comply with regulations and pay taxes and other things in order to produce, it's a cost of production, right? So if you put more regulation and taxation, it increases the cost of production, and the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts left. If you reduce regulation and taxation, it shifts right. You can see that if you're thinking about kind of differences between conservatives and liberals, it's not surprising that conservatives tend to focus more on the supply side of the equation of aggregate supply and aggregate demand than do liberals. I mean, conservative thinkers would say, well, gee, look, if we reduce the amount of government regulation, then the per unit cost of production will go up, and then as a result, aggregate supply will increase, and as a result of aggregate supply, there'll be more output, and more output, maybe higher wages, and so good things will happen with less regulation, right? Is this a legitimate argument? Well, yes, it's a legitimate argument. I mean, certainly there's byproducts to that, but I mean, this is, the supply side of the equation tends to be where conservatives tend to focus their attention, right? Their attention on the supply side. So if you cut regulations, the per unit cost of production goes up and the curve shifts right. You increase regulations, it shifts left, right? Okay. That's a lot. That's about 18 minutes. It's a really long video. I apologize for that. This is a kind of a tough notion to understand. I'll come back and put them together for you in a day or so. But best wishes to you. I know you're all getting bored and frustrated with being in the house, and let's hope towards the end of the month that there's a little relief to this, and that there's some kind of better treatments or other things that might get us moving a little bit more. But for now, let's just try our best to comply and do your best with your schoolwork. Best wishes to you.